Gaza's torment throws the British government into turmoil as a Foreign Office minister quits, saying Number 10's position is morally indefensible and against the national interest. Good evening. She's been warning David Cameron privately for weeks the government needs to match its words on Gaza with action. Now Baroness Varsi, the first Muslim woman to sit in cabinet, has resigned. In an exclusive interview with this programme, she tells us of her anguish that after the death of 400 innocent children, her government cannot find the words to condemn Israeli actions as disproportionate. Calling for an immediate arms embargo against Israel, she says it's wrong that Britain is selling weapons into a war zone and then spending taxpayers' money patching up civilians injured by those very weapons.
Was there a particular moment within the last 4 weeks where you thought, right, okay, that's it, I have to go?
I think there were many moments. I think every time a school was bombed, every time you saw pictures of Gaza with no lights on a night, every time a child about the age of my own children was killed.
And good evening from Gaza, where Channel 4 News once again comes to you live from outside the Shifa Hospital, just as the call to prayer begins up here in a very different place, because the ceasefire that is due to last 72 hours began this morning. And while the shock at civilian casualties is causing reverberations in London, it's also enabled us to see the true scale of the devastation here. I've been to Beit Hanun in the north of the Gaza Strip to see how residents there are seeking to put their lives back on some sort of footing. And I've met the family who are desperately trying to get their sick three-year-old daughter Hala medevaced out of Gaza for a life-saving operation in London. Can they make it out in time?
Also tonight, 10 minutes of terror. Passengers see their flight escorted into Manchester by a fighter jet after a warning that a device had been planted on board. And chaos in Calais as thousands of East African refugees trying to smuggle themselves into Britain come to blows.
And I'm in Glasgow, where the leaders of the yes and no camps in the Scottish referendum campaign will tonight go head-to-head in a televised debate. We've been testing the political temperature at the Edinburgh Festival and asking 16 and 17-year-old first-time voters what they think of the campaign so far.
If our budget gets reduced, which the Tory budget has been, it's been proposed to reduce Scottish Bloc grant.
You're presuming?
No, I'm not presuming, I'm telling you what's happening. This is my future and I want to secure the best future for me.
So she's the first minister to resign from the coalition government on an issue of principle. Sayeeda Warsi had been making her unhappiness known behind the scenes over government policy on Gaza. Today, though, she went public, dramatically announcing her resignation on Twitter, having sent David Cameron a letter saying his policy was morally indefensible. I've been talking exclusively to Baroness Varsi, and we'll hear from her in a moment. But first, here's how her shock announcement reverberated around Westminster and beyond. When Sayeeda Warsi snuffed out a candle last night to remember the World War I dead, she'd already taken the decision to extinguish her ministerial career, tweeting this morning that she'd resigned on a point of principle over the government's policy towards Gaza. In her letter to the Prime Minister, she wrote, "Our approach and language during the current crisis in Gaza is morally indefensible, is not in Britain's national interest, and will have a long-term detrimental impact on our reputation internationally and domestically." The first Muslim woman to sit in the cabinet, Baroness Varsi also said the government's failure to take a more robust stance against Israel will radicalise British Muslims. The Chancellor, George Osborne, appeared at a loss to know why she'd quit.
Well, I think this is a disappointing and frankly unnecessary decision. The British government is working with others in the world to bring peace to Gaza, and we do have now a tentative ceasefire, which of course we all hope will hold.
Baroness Varsi and her parliamentary colleagues have watched in horror as the death toll in Gaza has risen relentlessly. Many of the victims have been children, prompting Conservatives to demand not just words, but action from their government.
I've also written to the Prime Minister to express my grave concern, and I think that we do need a far stronger response to the humanitarian disaster that's unfolding in Gaza, where civilians are unable to leave and where they're even being bombed in UN sanctuaries. It's totally unacceptable, and we need to apply the same standards to civilian deaths in Gaza as we would to other populations.
To my colleagues who say, can you do a bit more megaphone diplomacy over here or over there, offend one side or the other side a bit more, I say it is more important to achieve the result, which I think we all want to see, which is an end to the killing.
Baroness Varsi wants the government to do more than simply review £8 billion worth of arms exports, putting an immediate embargo in place instead. Other ministers who might once have backed her up were removed at the reshuffle, leaving hers a lonely voice in a government where foreign policy is increasingly dictated by number 10.
Well, earlier I sat down with Baroness Varsi to talk to her about why she decided to resign. First, I asked her where she thought the government had gone wrong in its policy on Gaza.
I think the government, in relation to the current Gaza crisis, needed to be bolder in its language and more honest in its diplomacy.
In your resignation letter, you talked about how the government's policy on Gaza was morally indefensible, not in Britain's national interest, and that there'd be a long-term detrimental impact on our reputation. Really strong words.
I've championed over the last 2 years what I consider fundamental British values, the value of the rule of law, international justice, people being held to account for crimes that they may have committed. And I just sense that the position that we're taking in relation to the Gaza crisis, where we talk about accountability in the one breath, and yet less than 2 weeks ago we abstained on a Human Rights Council resolution which talked about accountability and about having an independent inquiry into alleged war crimes.
So there's a double standard from the government, do you think?
I think we've got to walk the walk and not just talk the talk, because foreign policy is about saying what you believe and then doing what you say.
Well, David Cameron has talked the talk recently, hasn't he? He has toughened up his rhetoric. I mean, yesterday he said the slaughter must end. And there is some sign of action, isn't there, in terms of the government reviewing arms exports and so on. I mean, things are happening behind the scenes, aren't they?
I think for me it's morally indefensible where after 4 weeks of a conflict, more than a quarter of the Gazan population displaced, nearly 2,000 people killed, nearly 400 innocent children killed, we still cannot find the words to say we condemn this and that we feel that this action has been disproportionate. These issues are far too serious for us to have been mealy-mouthed and for us to be dragging our heels.
Why has the government been mealy-mouthed then, in your view?
I think there is a sincerely held view in government that the best way to resolve this matter is to try and be as accommodating as possible to the Israeli government, to try and through that seek influence with them and through that to try and move them to a more positive decision. I'm not sure that policy is working.
Well, George Osborne said today that your resignation was frankly unnecessary and that the fruits of that quiet diplomacy were being seen today, a temporary ceasefire that he hopes will be permanent.
Well, George is a very good friend of the Israeli government, and therefore he, more than anybody else, should have been saying, quite frankly, to the Israeli government that what you are doing is not in your interest, that this is probably the single act of self-harm, that the biggest single act of self-harm that the Israeli government have done over the last few years. And what he should have been saying to the Israeli government is that it is unnecessary for you to kill innocent civilians. It is unnecessary for you to displace a quarter of the Gazan population. It is unnecessary for you to flatten schools, hospitals, and power supplies and water supplies to achieve your ends. And had George done that, then I agree with him, it would not have been necessary for me to resign.
We've talked about what the government needs to say on Israel, in your view. What about what it needs to do? I mean, some of your colleagues have been calling for arms embargoes, for sanctions. Where do you stand on that?
I think it is wrong for a country to allow arms to be supplied into a potential war zone. It seems odd that we have a policy at the moment where on the one hand we allow arms to be supplied, and on the other hand, we're spending taxpayers' money on patching up the people who may have been injured from the use of those arms. And therefore, we've got to be bold in taking this decision to say that until those who have been alleged to have committed war crimes over the last few weeks are brought to justice, then we must stop selling arms to Israel.
You talked in your resignation letter about early evidence from the Home Office suggesting that the government's response to the crisis in Gaza would radicalise Muslims. What were you referring to there?
There was a time when the biggest issue that people were talking about was Syria. It then became ISIS. It then became various other issues. But systematically, for the last 4 weeks, the only thing that people are talking about, and this is not just young Muslims, this is young people and communities across the board, is the issue of Gaza. And there is no doubt that that is, therefore, a potential for radicalisation for young people. And as Minister for Faith and Communities, I specifically had this brief which straddled the Foreign Office and a domestic department, because I fundamentally believe that the way in which we conduct ourselves domestically does impact upon our reputation internationally, and the way we behave internationally does have blowback for us domestically, and that is something that we need to be uniquely aware of, and that is why it's important that we live by our principles and that we see through what we say we believe in.
It's a pretty dramatic claim, though, isn't it, that, you know, government policy on Gaza could end up with more British Muslims, for example, going off and fighting overseas.
It's not a claim that I make. It's evidence which is there in black and white from the work that the Home Office is doing.
Circulated internally within the government.
And of course there are external people who are working on this as well. So there is evidence out there, as there was in relation to Syria, as there was in relation to Iraq, as there was. I mean, these reports and this evidence makes for uncomfortable reading, but we can either bury our head in the sand and pretend it's not there, or we can start to tackle it.
How widespread are these concerns that you're expressing amongst your Conservative colleagues, do you think?
Without dropping people in it, I can say that there is unease on our backbenchers. There is concern at ministerial level. I can say very candidly that I've had one senior Conservative on the phone in tears about material that they'd seen and the fact that they felt we weren't doing anything about it.
A minister, was it?
Not a minister, a backbencher. I've had a minister in a late-night conversation talking about resignation. You know, there is real concern amongst Conservatives on this issue, and I hope that this move by me, this has been an incredibly difficult decision, personal decision for me, Cathy, but I hope if there is some good that comes out of it, it is that people who feel the same way as I do are now prepared to raise those voices within government, and also are taken seriously.
Was there a particular moment within the last 4 weeks where you thought, right, okay, that's it, I have to go?
I think there were many moments. I think every time a school was bombed, every time you saw pictures of Gaza with no lights on a night, every time a child about the age of my own children was killed, the moment when young boys playing football on the beach suddenly were there no longer. These were incredibly difficult moments, and I think, Cathy, had I been the Minister at the Department for Transport or the Minister at the Department for the Environment, you could have said, well, I'm part of a bigger government position. I was the Minister who had to stand up in the House of Lords on a daily basis and answer questions on this. I therefore had a responsibility, and I therefore felt that to take that responsibility to its natural conclusion, when I felt that I couldn't change a government policy that I disagreed with, I had to step down.
Sayeeda Warsi, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Baroness Warsi talking exclusively to Cathy in London. Well, here, Israel has been withdrawing its troops from Gaza as the three-day ceasefire gets underway. And by now, they say they have all been pulled back beyond the border, where they wait in what they call defensive positions, watching. Our reporter Inigo Gilmore is in Israel and has been talking to some of those soldiers as they came out.
For nearly a month, Israel's heavy weaponry has relentlessly pounded Gaza. But today, the artillery and tanks finally pulled back beyond the border. Israeli troops have pulled back about 2 miles from the border with Gaza to these positions here. So far, it's all quiet. But these troops are planning to stay put after previous ceasefires broke down. The Israeli army today boldly declared mission accomplished. But as the fog of yet another damaging war starts to lift, many familiar questions about the army's alleged disproportionate use of force and accusations of war crimes. They're questions I wanted to put to the commander of Israel's southern forces at a briefing. But when we got there, we were told only Israeli journalists were allowed. Foreign media would be briefed separately, we were told. But no invitation was forthcoming. We're trying to understand why we're being barred from speaking to the general.
It's not that you are being barred.
Since this war began, it seems Israelis have sought to insulate themselves from international condemnation. At a nearby petrol station, reservists were on their way home, going back to their regular jobs after weeks of war. I sat down to talk with some of them. Some soldiers were saying that they felt they may have to end up going back to Gaza. Would he have liked to continue? Does he feel the operation is complete?
I believe that at some point we will have to return. In 1 year, 4, maybe 5. But I believe at some point we will be back. I think that a terrorist organisation that is not dead at its roots will grow back again.
Your closest ally, the United States, has been very critical of the Israeli military and the Israeli operation and hitting of schools in Gaza. Is that a problem for you?
Hamas is using human shields of children and shooting from schools and shooting from mosques, and you need to take care of this threat. The people who need to take care of that, they will. If the UN say there are war crimes, get into Gaza and figure the things out. I'm not concerned about
But there's been many more casualties in this operation than 2009 or the one in 2012. And does that not make people feel some discomfort?
Me and all my friends are sorry for all children. All children that have been killed. We're sorry for them, and no one likes to see children dies. No one wants to kill any children.
Do you feel uncomfortable, or do you know if any soldiers are uncomfortable about some of the orders they were given, or some of the things that they did during this war?
It's a hard question to say. Every soldier have sometimes uncomfortable things that you have to do. But you overall you follow orders. You do what your officers tell you to do, and you trust them to do the right thing.
Most Israelis remain united behind the message that the army did everything it could to prevent civilian casualties in Gaza, despite the high death toll. But if this operation is finally over, there will now be a chance to examine more closely the disturbing allegations of war crimes.
Inigo Gilmore reporting from Israel. Well, it's been 28 days since fighting began affecting lives in both Israel and Gaza. With an uneasy 3-day ceasefire in place, both sides are today counting the cost. Israel says more than 3,000 rockets have been fired from Gaza into Israel since the conflict began. 3 Israeli civilians have been killed, as well as 64 soldiers. In the Gaza Strip, the worst affected areas sit within a 3-kilometre buffer zone along the Israeli border. Recent satellite images show some of these areas before and then during the conflict. This is the area of Atatra. Beit Hanun has also been badly damaged. Residents there returned to their homes today to find scenes of devastation. In all across Gaza, the UN has so far provisionally identified more than 10,000 damaged or destroyed buildings. But the human cost is the most startling. The UN estimates that almost 1,800 people have been killed, with almost 500,000 displaced. Well, as we arrived into Gaza earlier on today, it was a very different place to the city that Paul Mason had been reporting only yesterday. People were out on the streets taking swift advantage of that ceasefire to get to the shops, to buy provisions and to go to their homes. The UN says many of those schools where hundreds of thousands of people have been staying are starting to empty in places as people find they can return home. But that is a long way off for many, many of those people. And earlier today, I went to Beit Hanun, one of the most devastated areas in the north, to see what damage had been done. After 4 weeks cooped up and terrified, they poured onto the streets today in Gaza, a chance not just to stock up, but to take stock of what has happened. In Beit Hanun, near the border with Israel, they were pounded by tanks and missiles. Israel says it was targeting Hamas fighters. The people here say they were just civilians. The Kafana family were picking through the rubble of their home of 30 years. This is where your family stayed?
Yes.
How many people?
About 10.
10?
Yes. You can see.
What will you do now?
I can't see anything.
Where are you sleeping?
I don't know we don't have anywhere.
Her sister, Maisara, arrived and took me to what's left of her house. And this is your building. Can you show me?
This to my aunt's dear. This is to my brother. And the second floor. And this two my brothers live in it. One my brother and it.
What?
This is to my uncle's daughters and sons.
Was there any Hamas here?
What?
Hamas were here?
No.
No rockets?
No.
You can see the Israeli border from the Kafana family home, but after 4 weeks of this bombardment, they're left with nothing but anger and bitterness for their neighbours. Maisara introduced me to her sister-in-law.
I will not forgive them. They're our enemy. They've destroyed our lives.
The destruction is just astonishing. It's like an earthquake has hit here. And within a few hours, people have poured onto the streets to try and salvage what they can. And this team behind me are looking for bodies under the rubble. There were 2 men buried under these remains. Again, the local people insisted they were civilians. Were they fighters?
We have no fighters here. Everyone who died was a civilian. No fighters died here. Thank God the fighters are still alive.
But there are other victims of this war in desperate need of help to stay alive. We've heard about a family who've lost their home in Beit Hanun and are now staying here in this UN school in Jabalia. They have a 3-year-old who's got some very extreme medical problems and needs to be taken out of Gaza for an urgent operation. The fighting has meant cases like this have been held up. No, it's fine. Hala has a congenital heart defect that needs surgery, and that can't be done here. A local and British charity are working together to try and get her medevac out. When she is tired, she is completely dying, said her mother. Without this medication, she will be gone. This corner of a classroom shared with 60 people is not just home, but hospital ward too. Every person has their corner. This is mine, that's my brother's. This place is affecting my daughter, he said. Hala is one of many who desperately need medical help here in Gaza. But for her, at least, there is now a chance to get her out during this 72-hour window. The question across this region, though, is, will the ceasefire extend beyond that? Well, the news from London is that there are more reverberations in the government tonight, where Nick Clegg, the Deputy Prime Minister, is apparently calling for the suspension of arms export licenses to the Israeli government. And we'll see whether the conservative side of this coalition responds to that. But clearly, there are lots of things going on in the government in terms of disagreement over what the British government's position should be with regard to Israel. Well, joining me now is Dr. Raji al-Sorani from the Palestinian Center for Human Rights, and your concern really is the whole question of war crimes. But legally, can there be a war crimes investigation over anything that's happened in Gaza?
Yes, I think Israel committed in a clear-cut, deliberate way war crimes, crimes against humanity, and that's evident. These war crimes, even some of it has been broadcasted live on air at the real time, and the whole world saw it.
But if Palestine hasn't ratified the International Criminal Court law, how can there be an investigation here? There is no real process.
We are doing that. We are legally documenting all human rights grave breaches and war crimes, and we did that in the past. We did it also in 2008, 2009 war, 2012 war, and we are doing it this time. I mean, during the bombing we were doing, this legal documentation for war crimes has been committed, and we are continuing, in this process all the way along.
Do you know why there are no external observers here gathering evidence if this is a crime scene?
We are professional enough, and we have the capacity and the expertise enough to build these legal files, and we did that. We filed many of the cases, whether in UK, Spain, US, but in these countries they changed the laws to provide more legal and political immunity for the Israeli war criminals, including Doron el-Mok case, Tzipi Livni case, or in Spain.
What do you make of the British government's position? You'll have heard that one of the ministers who sits in cabinet, Baroness Varsi, has resigned over the British position, and tonight the Deputy Prime Minister is calling for the suspension of arms export licenses to Israel.
I think suspending the arms purchase to Israel is a very important step. UK Prime Minister gave license to kill, and he endorsed the rule of jungle when he accepted the Israeli position by allowing, Israel to launch this war, which civilian targets were in the eye of the storm.
Well, I'm sure he'd dispute that analysis, but thank you very much indeed for joining us tonight. That's it from here in Gaza tonight. Over to Jackie Long in Glasgow.
Still to come tonight, I'm in Glasgow as the Scottish independence debate steps up a gear. Tonight the leaders of the yes and no campaigns go head-to-head for the first time. We've been to Edinburgh to see how the festival is reacting to next month's vote. And we've been talking to young first-time voters about what it'll take to win their political affections.
September. My name's Kirsty Nicholson. I volunteer for Yes Scotland, and yeah, I'm just here to sort of spread the word, find out who's left that we need to persuade to vote yes and persuade them.
Now, a man has been arrested on suspicion of making a hoax bomb threat